Hi folks, you were Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast. In this essay, I'd like to talk about, it's a subject I covered a while ago, it's about expenditure of ammunition and the ratio of bullets fired to casualties inflicted on the enemy in warfare in a particular battle. Now, in some instances, decent statistics and reliable information exists, in others not so much. Whenever you look at a review of a battle, even battles that occurred 100 years ago or so, say for example the Zulu wars in the late 1870s in what today is part of South Africa. You look at those Zulu wars and you look at the description of the battle, and then you look at the number of bullets fired to casualties inflicted, and the two just don't add up. So you have to go back to say, well, look, on balance of probability, the description of the battle is not an accurate one, or is misrepresenting part of it, or the soldiers involved must have been the worst shots that ever existed in human history. Let's assume that none of those are necessarily true. Now, the description of, say, the Battle of Islandwana, where 1,000 or so British troops were overrun by an army of approximately 20,000 Zulus, and most were killed. I mean, some got away, but this is seen as in terms of a battle that involving regular troops and native warriors with spears and shields. This was considered a crushing defeat and one of the most noteworthy defeats in certainly the Victorian era of the British military. Now, the description, I'll simplify it a bit. The description was that thousands upon thousands of Zulus just all charged the British lines at once, and they were simply overwhelmed by numbers, and with single-shot rifles, which they could only start using at about 400 yards. You know, these Zulu warriors were charging, and at 400 yards they would have completed that in 60 seconds. They were, give or take 60 seconds, they would have got to the British lines, and then it would have been engaged in hand-to-hand combat. With the Zulus using their spears and cowhide shields and so on, where they would have had up close like that, they would have had the advantage. But was that the case? Let's suppose it was true. And now you've got around 650 to 700 regular soldiers that are experienced shots, and their battle season, all that sort of stuff. So in 60 seconds, they could have approximately they could have rattled off 2,500 shots, give or take. There was another contingent where they could have say gone half that rate, so say put another 500, so they would have rattled off maybe 1,000 shots. Remember, single shot rifle. Now it's a long range rifle with very heavy bullets, so if it hits you, it's going to cause serious damage. So say 3,500 bullets being shot. In addition to that, there was some field guns, light field guns, but they could take out 10, 20 people if they were massed ranks charging at them at a time. And they're also a small rocket detachment called the Congreve rockets that also could inflict decent damage. Now, with all that going on, and the battle at Islandwana lasted, give or take, about 2 hours. So it wasn't like it was a battle that raged all day or anything. But if we look at the stats for that, the British had access to 150,000 rounds of ammunition. Now this is at Islandwana, so 150,000 rounds, and they, at best, the Martini Henry rifles could fire 20 to 25 rounds an hour before they got too hot, and the various components of the gun would seize up, or you had to wait to cool, for it to cool down before we could shoot again, and this sort of thing. So, given that, at most and over 2 hours, assuming all the British soldiers were firing at the same time, which wouldn't have been likely, but that they would have fired a maximum of 40,000 rounds. I don't think anywhere near that was fired, by the way. Now, the Zulu casualties were supposedly 1,000 dead and a further 1,000 that died from subsequent injuries. So unless the British had a lot of spare rifles at hand, they couldn't have had a firing rate above 20 shots, 22, 23, maybe 25 of the outside shots per hour. So if we look at the casualty, the Zulus, fairly light casualties. They got ballpark 20,000 warriors there that are supposedly charging down the lines, and they've only got casualties of 1,000. Now, if they were massed charging the lines, the British lines, given the rate of fire, the British could have kept up over the 400 metres, and they were shooting actually at 500 metres already. But nonetheless, and the time it would take the Zulus to, assuming they kept on charging and didn't go to ground, this sort of thing. But if they charged the lines, then it seems inconceivable that given the amount of shots that the British got into massed Zulu line, remember massed, that means there's no daylight between one body and the next. It seems inconceivable that they would have got such a low rate of casualties. Just looking at that, there would have been 15% thereabouts, assuming the massed. Now, I don't believe that's what happened. I don't think there was mass charging. The numbers just simply don't add up. Maybe after every volley, the Zulus crept forward another few meters and dropped down again, and so on. But the casualty rate was very low. Now, the assumption is that up to 40,000 rounds were fired by the British troops at Islandwana. I don't think it was that high, but let's assume something like that. And if we assume the numbers of 1,000 dead on the field and 1,000 dying subsequently, I don't know how they would know that. So then that's still a rate of 5% maximum of the shots of finding a target of any sort of, whether it be in outright death or an injury. Now, on top of that, remember, we've got the field guns and the rockets that are going. And so how many casualties were from there is a bit hard to say. But the idea that there was mass charging of the British lines just simply doesn't compute here. If there was mass charging, then the casualties would be much higher. So we're looking at a very different situation here. We're looking at, again, the Zulus creeping forward on their on their bellies, going into gullies. Remember, the Zulus are going uphill to Islandwana. There's not a steep grade, but it's a grade nonetheless, heading up to where the British positions were. So now, when the Zulus got within charging distance, which would have to be 50 metres or less, you'd think, then the chances are that the British could only have got off, even the most experienced shot could only have got off maybe 2 shots into the. So that would be more likely. So it doesn't appear in that battle, certainly based on the ammunition expenditure, based on the casualties inflicted, that there was anything resembling a mass charge. The Zulus were approaching cautiously. Again, they were using the gullies and the any sort of grass cover, anything at all, as they slowly crept forward. And again, maybe making a run, dropping down as the volley, this sort of thing. And then once they were close at hand, so they could engage in hand-to-hand fighting, then they would have made the charge, and of course, where they had that advantage. Now, if we look at the sort of the um, the battle site after, even today you can see that based on the ammunition. It seems that the British line was broken up, and they broke up into little groups where they tried to form the British square, the four sides, so that they could defend from. But again, this wasn't really working, because the Zulus again would sort of crawl on the ground and then charge at the last minute. Again, the close quarters fighting, where the Zulus had that short thrusting spear, and when the British would have, once they'd done the single shot rifle, would have been different if they've all had repeater rifles. But the single shot rifle was really meant to be a weapon to operate at distance. Then they had the long bayonets, but at the close quarters fighting, where they would have been with the Zulus, the Zulu shield could have brushed the rifle aside, and then the thrust of the spear. And the Zulus were, much fitter guys than the British would have been, so they would have easily prevailed in that hand-to-hand fighting. So when we look at that Islandwana battle, it's certainly not massed Zulus charging down the British lines. If they were mass charges against those British Martini Henry riflemen, then the Zulus would have suffered 5,000 plus casualties, easily suffered 5,000 plus casualties. And it's hard to believe they would have kept on charging with that ratio of casualties. Now, considering that the Zulus viewed even 10% casualties as being a disaster, if they'd been doing the charging down thing there, they would have suffered easily 20% plus casualties. So that would have been beyond a disaster. Even so, the numbers of Zulu dead and British dead, the Zulus still lost more men than the British did in that Islandwana battle. So to sort of perceive it from the British perspective, it was an embarrassing and humiliating defeat. But from the Zulu perspective, losing that many men in a battle was considered disastrous. And really, after Islandwana, the King Chetaweo of the Zulus wasn't looking, I don't want any more battles like that, not when I'm losing that many people. Bear in mind too that the Zulu armies couldn't be in the field really for that long. They had many other duties to do with agriculture, and other jobs were needed, looking after livestock and things like that. So they had many other things to do, and the loss of that many people, that many, not just soldiers but workers, was considered a disaster. Now, if we sort of move to another famous battle too from that time, the Battle of Rorke's Drift. That was like a depot or a station, a supply station that was not far away. It was only some miles away from Islandwana, and the Zulus decided, after one of the princes of the Zulu sort of royal family, if you like, decided that he could win some vanity points for himself and go over to Rorke's Drift, because there were 100 odd British soldiers there. Now, the Rorke's Drift, it was if you look at the most of the bullets had been taken, so they didn't have a vast number of bullets there, or certainly not as many as there were supposedly around 30,000, or a little over, maybe closer to 35,000 bullets there, although the numbers do vary on that depending on the source. Now, the battle there lasted between 10 and 12 hours, and 4 or 5 hours of that were at night time. So there's around 130 riflemen there. Not all of them skilled, sort of practiced riflemen, but most of them were. And so, say over 10 to 12 hours, depending on whose numbers, it's 130 rifles. So there's ballpark 29,000 bullets were fired. So that's ballpark 200 bullets per rifle, or 20 plus bullets per hour. So that's, in Martini Henry terms, that's at the upper end of what the rifle's capable of, 20 plus bullets an hour. Again, I don't know how many spare rifles they had. So if a rifle did get a busted firing pin or got too hot and started to warp out of shape or so, could they have gone and got another rifle? I don't know. That's not clear. So 29,000 bullets were fired over that time of the battle. Now the reports were that approximately 400 Zulu dead bodies were found around the Rorke's Drift depot. So 29,000 bullets only managed to kill 400 Zulus. Now the claim was from some that, again, this was Zulus, approximately 4,500 Zulus were mass charging the station, which is also doubled as a mission, a religious mission. And so if there were mass charges and 29,000 bullets were fired by a majority of experienced riflemen, then they only managed to hit 400 people in over 10 hours. That doesn't add up. Now, supposedly, as the trail of when the Zulus were departing was followed, approximately 300 additional dead Zulus were found who'd been wounded in the battle and hadn't died but had subsequently succumbed to their wounds. So even if we look at the maximum number of, say, 700, so that's still only 700 deaths from 29,000 bullets, supposedly, again, from mass charges. Now, part of that Rorke's Drift battle was at night, so you'd have a situation where the soldiers, they heard noises or the sound of the Zulu warriors approaching. They'd have just fired into the dark, hoping to hit something, or at the very least deter the Zulus from making an attack. But what we've got here is that most of the fighting wasn't, if there was any mass charges, it again would have been Zulus crawling along and jumping up at the last minute. Now, the difference at Rorke's Drift was they built a redoubt of supply box, the large supply boxes and mealie bags and bags with sand in them, that sort of stuff. They put all that up. So when the Zulus reached if the Zulus did manage to crawl along the ground and then jump up at the last minute, they couldn't engage immediately in hand-to-hand fighting. And the reports were that the Martini Henry rifles, which after a few shots, by the way, became quite hot, the Zulus would try and grab the barrels of the rifles and would find they badly burn their hands because the barrel was so hot. Now, if the barrel was that hot, you couldn't really use it to fire again. So the rate of fire would have dropped down as the riflemen waited for the barrel to cool so they could do it, fire it again. So I don't think that there was mass charges in Rorke's Drift either. The Zulus would have been killed at point blank range, and given the size of the wounds on some of them, then that would fit, because when they came to the fortifications, if you will, they couldn't immediately engage in the hand-to-hand fighting. But 29,000 bullets fired, which is reported to be the case at Rorke's Drift. Some, by the way, the estimates of bullets fired vary. They started around 20,000 and go up to nearly 30,000. So there's quite a difference of 10,000. That's a huge difference. So it's difficult to know whose numbers to rely on. But if you're firing 29,000 bullets and you're only hitting it at most, 700 people, that's a tiny proportion of, again, you're looking at what 3%, not even 3% hitting. So 97 bullets out of every 100 are fired are missing the mark. So that's not mass ranks that you're shooting into there. That's that you're shooting at fast moving targets that are moving in small units and again, in some cases moving at night. Now, this means a lot of the information we've got about battles at Islandwara and Rorke's Drift are probably quite suspect as a consequence. We're looking at other things here. we're looking at the Zulus moving by stealth, and not the mass charges. Zulus were familiar enough with firearms at the time to know what they could do, and anybody knows you don't go charging into that. Now this makes the World War One interesting because with the advent of the machine gun, the entire concept of warfare was changed. Now the concept of warfare prior to the machine gun was that if you advance into the enemy lines, sort of unflinching and steadfast, that the bayonet sort of pointed, that the enemy won't be able to keep up won't be able to deliver a rate of fire or keep up a rate of fire enough to decimate your ranks, the ranks of the advancing infantry. And the idea of seeing these people unflinching, uncaring about death, bayonets pointed, is enough to break the nerve of really any sort of infantry line. And you see, there were already changes as the rifle came along, particularly with, say, the Swedish, during the arquebus, the early stage rifles, where there'd be a kneeling group, a crouching group and then a taller group of infantry with those early stage rifles, muskets in effect, and so they would deliver a volley fire on 3 ranks. And now that was notoriously unreliable there, and the rate of fire wasn't high because you had to load the shot, then you had to clean the barrel, then load a bullet into the barrel of the rifle, and then set it alight with and so on. So it was a major exercise. So even people who were very experienced and adept at it could maybe get off 2 shots a minute. And the range wasn't really that good, but again, 200-300 yards. So you couldn't get off many shots. So they were certainly limited in what it could achieve in terms of casualties. This changed a bit with the long distance rifles improved, particularly with distance and accuracy. And Martini Henry was probably one of the apex of long distance, so you could still get a lethal hit across 500 meters. Now, if you look at an organized infantry group marching in order, and let's say you're marching fairly slowly if you're staying in order, and you can start firing on them at 500 meters, assuming it's a first world infantry type engagement, then you can inflict a lot of casualties there. But it's different when you get native contingent like the Zulus that'll use ravines, come to ground, and won't do a final charge until they're up close. So it's very different concept. Now, you go to World War One, where machine guns played a very prominent role. Then both sides, to some extent, had the same idea of a massed infantry charge, knowing that some of your people will get through. They won't be able to kill all of them, so some of them will get through. But machine guns changed that, so inflicting quite heavy casualties on those that were charging without really a corresponding benefit in winning any battles. So the number of bullets it took to inflict casualties in World War One, or certainly during the mass charge battles, that went up quite considerably. Most of the bullets were actually, well, many not, were finding a target. This changed in World War II, where the number of bullets fired to achieve a casualty declined. Very few bullets were finding their mark. You had to shoot a lot of bullets to get a casualty. And the epitome of this, or the very apex of that, being in Vietnam, where you've got guerrilla insurgents hiding in jungles, and where you've got to lay down a massive fire just to keep the enemy contained, let alone hit anything. So in some battles in Vietnam, the reports were that it was taking 10,000, even more bullets per casualty, which seems astonishing. And you also look at the cost of warfare, where you're expending that many bullets, and only rich countries could actually do it. So in the case of World War II, British soldiers were being reminded that every bullet costs 3 cents or something like that, or costs 5 cents. So don't waste it. Make sure you've got a target identified, and that you've got your sights leveled, because of the expense of producing a bullet, which You guys shouldn't be in warfare if you're going to look at it that way. So this is but just on the issue of bullets expended, ammunition expended for casualties, if we go back to Islandwana and those sort of battles, the description of the battle and the ammunition expenditure don't really line up, and that's the I guess the main purpose of doing this video. You're being a Tacitus today at your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.